Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We'll get started in just a second. Just waiting for people to join in from the entry area to the webinar. We'll give us just a second. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Securing SAP SuccessFactors, Best Practices to Stay Compliant and Keep Data Safe, hosted by SAP Insider and presented by Lookout. I'm Robert Holland from SAP Insider, and I will be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and we invite you to submit your questions using the questions area within the console. We will answer as many questions as time permits. A copy of today's presentation will be available for download in an email after today's session. Now, on to the presentation. Discussing today's topics will be Hank Schless. Hank is the Senior Manager of Security Solutions at Lookout, and Madhu Dutta. Madhu is the Senior Product Manager from Lookout. So, Hank, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Madhu and I are very happy to be here. So Madhu, you want to say hi here?
Yes, certainly. Hello, everyone. Very nice to meet all of you virtually.
Awesome. So we're happy to be with everyone today and with SAP Insiders. Thank you guys for having us here. We're going to cover things I think it's going to be a pretty straightforward agenda today. We're going to go over some of the cloud challenges that come with migrating workloads up into cloud-based apps and infrastructure. Look at some of the research that Robert and his colleagues have done at SAP Insiders, and then really help that set the context for what drives SAP users specifically to kind of understand what security challenges come along with that, what compliance challenges may come along with that, as so much of what is stored within SAP apps have to do with compliance. And then we're going to look at some of the customer journey stories and understand what out there in the real world has been applicable to these use cases. And then as Robert mentioned, we really do encourage this to be interactive. We have a few questions at the end that we'll ask of everybody, and hopefully through the course of the conversation some things pop into your head. We love to be interactive here, so we can kind of get rolling here. So Robert, I kind of want to start this off with a conversation based in some research that you did earlier this year, understanding some of the benefits of cloud platforms, but also understanding why people are moving workloads to the cloud, how they're selecting a service provider, and then really how they're measuring success within cloud initiatives. And you obviously went through all this in your report back in September, but would love to hear from you firsthand about some of your research and some of your findings.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, what we sort of did little differently with this year's research is we drilled specifically into SAP workloads, right? We'd sort of looked for the last couple of years about how people are adopting cloud workloads in general, but this year we really drilled into how are they adopting SAP workloads in the cloud. And I think the overall factors that are sort of pushing organizations, the business drivers, because the way SAP Insider looks at research is around a particular topic. We basically follow, we look at 4 different things. We look at the overarching business drivers. So what are the things that are really impacting them on a day-to-day basis? The actions or strategies that they're implementing in response to those drivers. The requirements from a people, process, and technology perspective that they have to meet as they, take those actions, and then the actual technologies that they're, implementing at the bottom line, right? So from a high level perspective, those business drivers haven't really changed that much over the last 3 years. Primarily, it's still a focus on digital transformation. That was the biggest driver. Modernizing infrastructure, particularly so that they can lower costs. They want to access newer technologies. For a lot of organizations, and even SAP is largely moving this way with a lot of what they're doing from a technology perspective. A lot of their development money and development funds is moving more into the cloud solutions than in on-premise solutions. It's not that they're not, upgrading and enhancing their on-prem solutions. It's just that more of the focus is on the cloud-based technologies, and this is where I think people are sort of looking at the cloud as a way to adopt newer technologies, and then of course being able to adopt them more quickly. And then as a response to that, I think that they're redesigning a bunch of their IT architecture in order to help lower those costs, increase flexibility. There's a number of different responses and they haven't changed. What really changed, we saw in the results this year as compared particularly to last year and the year before that, is people are still moving to the cloud, but it's a bit of a more measured approach, and they're more concerned about security as they move to the cloud. And cost, managing the costs particularly, because although cloud offers, the alternative of, operational expenditure as against CapEx, which can be, difficult for organizations. You purchase a piece of software, you have to get the hardware in it. This can be millions, hundreds of millions, depending on the size of your organization. But over time, if that cost isn't managed, that can still end up being very expensive for an organization. Sometimes, it's not necessarily immediately, but in 5-6 years, it can end up being just as much as that on-premise implementation might have been. But particularly from a requirement standpoint, where we saw the change is that, while having security-focused requirements had always been there, now they're the top two, right? So some sort of data encryption, some sort of data protection. And and I think this sort of really plays into the way they choose a cloud service provider, because I think as you've got there, it is based on, keeping systems up. Obviously one of the things people want to do when they move to the cloud is, resiliency. They want to have uptime. They don't want to lose that. And that's where, the SLA comes from, data center locations for fast access. But security is right up there, right? That's one of the top factors they have. And then, similarly, when they measure the success of those, it's around, as I said, reducing cost, increasing flexibility, faster deployment of applications, and then, being able to be more efficient as an organization. So, it's really interesting what sort of came out of that study, but it's cloud's still there. People are taking a more measured approach. But they're very much more focused on security, particularly over the last year, than they have been in the past. And despite last year, everyone's suddenly starting to work from home, and changing where your security perimeter is as an organization. That had started to play into people's responses last year, but it's really shown up more this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting your point about cost, because actually I was talking to a reporter over at, I think it was over at SC Media just yesterday about this, about how people kind of have this this idea in their head that the cloud is cheaper. But then when you start to kind of tie in, especially if you're running multi-cloud, you have a lot of overlap in what's provided. So for a lot of people, it's about kind of finding the efficiencies there, and like you said, for those larger organizations, a lot of times you need those instances with larger compute power to be able to support the business as a whole. So it's interesting that you found that as kind of one of the drivers, and that really does take a few years to fully understand what the cost of it will be, because it's not immediate.
Yeah, it's interesting. What also interested me in the results this year is that if very few people are using just one public cloud provider, like if you're using a public cloud provider, for example, Azure for some of your SAP applications, nearly 50% of the people who were also using Azure were also using AWS for at least some of their SAP applications, right? So sometimes I think it's like, I'll put this on multiple providers, so if one goes down, it gives me resiliency. But others is just they don't want to be locked in to a particular provider. They want to have choice, in where they go and what they do. But that can also increase cost, right? Because you're having, you know, these different applications running on different providers in different places, and you know, it's something you definitely have to monitor and manage as an organization.
Yeah, definitely. So next here, you know, we do want to go over kind of some of the challenges that we see with cloud-based platforms. And these are a little more broad. You know, this kind of still speaking generally here, because there are so many benefits to the cloud, and like Robert mentioned, there's a lot that goes into that decision making. But we find that there are about 5 key challenges that come with it. And the first one actually we started touching on, the massive number of cloud apps, or honestly of cloud providers, you know, make it difficult to ensure that uniform alignment across all of your services with security and compliance requirements, right? If you've got some workloads, I mean, the perfect example that Robert just used, if some workloads are running AWS, some workloads are running in Azure, some are, you know, even within that, some different types of apps, even different, you know, different SAP apps, right? These are all places where data lives, and part of the cost that comes with all of this is not just dollars, but also you know, human capital and time, right? If you have to go into each service every time and tweak some of your security settings to be able, or your compliance settings to be able to match whatever the latest update is to, you know, to CCPA or to GDPR or HIPAA or whatever it may be, that's going to take a lot of time. So that's definitely one of the challenges we see. And then, you know, Robert mentioned, obviously, you know, people are working from everywhere, but it's really more about where people are accessing data from and how they are accessing it. So they also have this expectation, your employees all have this expectation that they can get to the data they need to be able to get work done. And you want to be able to open up that access enough that people can feel comfortable doing so, but you don't want to limit it so much with security parameters that they feel hindered, or they feel like they're kind of being watched, especially if you allow people to use personal devices in kind of this BYOD model. But you also don't want to allow so much that you then have security risk due to over entitlement of privileges. So that can be a tricky line to kind of balance there. Next is that Robert mentioned that people are kind of moving outside the corporate perimeter here. I think that we can safely say the traditional perimeter has all but disappeared, and for that reason, visibility has become a real issue, especially when you think about things like shadow IT, right? People using apps that they feel they're more productive on, but maybe haven't been approved for corporate use. And therefore, it then creates this ecosystem where you have data constantly moving in and out of sanctioned and unsanctioned cloud apps, which is a whole challenge in itself. And really, that's, you know, that kind of ties to this next one here of that high risk of an unintentional data leak, right? This is something where someone may not realize that they have mistakenly dropped, you know, a sensitive file in their personal Google Drive or their personal Dropbox or whatever it may be, if these are apps you use at work. And so again, that line between personal and enterprise is definitely started to blur. And then finally, you know, like Robert said, the success of the business really is frequently tied to how well an organization can embrace the cloud and enable both their employees and their customers. So it really becomes, you know, KPIs start to drive the, you know, what defines success with cloud migration and cloud enablement, and that's not just internally, but externally as well. So Madhu, I want to bring it over to you for this one, because you have a lot of success and experience chatting with SAP users and some of the challenges they face. So do you want to run through these challenges here?
Yeah, certainly, Hank. While Hank kind of talked about the general cloud user challenges, I want to focus a little more on specifically SAP systems. And undoubtedly, Hank, SAP systems holds one of the most sensitive data for any organizations. For example, SAP SuccessFactors holds employee data, like PII data of employees. Likewise, C4HANA holds customer data. So it's so much of PII and regulatory related data that is held in SAP systems. And that naturally brings a question on securing those systems appropriately. And some things we are constantly hearing from customers is around the governance and compliance of managing these data. And there's also so much shift and change that's happening on the regulatory aspect of the story as well, and GDPR leading it. Now, anytime there is a breach notification, there's a penalty associated to it. So there's a expectation from organizations on how the data in systems are dealt with. When there is a breach notification or threats, data disclosure is becoming increasingly challenging for organizations. Likewise, there's a shift that's happening on the data privacy laws as well. Again, GDPR leading it for a lot of the organizations. And we are seeing a trend with CCPA coming to US and many more countries adopting such kind of regulations. So organizations, especially global organizations with operations in multiple countries, are thinking about, as we move our systems from on-premises to cloud, how do we make sure we move it in a compliant manner, in a way that we are compliant to various international and also local country-specific laws as well. Those are some of the challenges we're constantly hearing from security team, especially dealing with SAP systems. And with data now moving from on-premises to cloud, the access to the data, like who has access to what kind of data and who is supposed to have access to what kind of data, is becoming increasingly important as well from a compliance standpoint.
Call myself on mute. You'd think after a year and a half of this, I'd figure that out. So thank you, Madhu. That's super helpful and definitely setting that context here. Especially focusing in on SAP users. So thanks for bringing your experience in for that. Now, the next couple of things, Robert, I want to kind of come back to you and some of the research that you've done. This is coming. I want to focus on some stats we saw in the benchmark report that you guys put out in April. From what I understand, this was a pretty security-focused report. But can you take us through some of these top drivers for securing SAP and what you saw through your research?
And I just did the same thing you did. I talked when I was muted. Absolutely. And it was this was, I think the report that we put out in April was securing the SAP landscape. It sort of looked at the different technologies, particularly that people are using, but we started off with, well, what are the biggest concerns that you have around securing your SAP systems? And the number one concern that people had, I think, was really protecting the data in those systems. I mean, SAP systems contain all sorts of information that could be critical for some, third-party entity to exploit, right? I don't necessarily want to say hacker, but I don't think SAP systems are necessarily hacked in the same way that other systems might be, but they're more likely to be exposed to something like a credentials compromise. And we 27% of the people who responded to our survey said that they were aware of a credentials compromise happening within their organization. Now, my guess is the number is higher, and they just simply weren't aware of the fact, or maybe they just didn't want to admit to it, because I mean, who wants to admit to the fact that credentials have been compromised? But I mean, we know particularly for ERP systems that when a system is compromised from a credential standpoint, it can be weeks or months before that is necessarily exposed and detected. And that's because the person is logging in with a valid user ID, and then they're just taking advantage and accessing data, perhaps in a way that is problematic. Maybe they're approving invoices that they shouldn't be approving to fake, to fake people. And a lot of times, sometimes it's someone inside the organization, which is another way that organizations don't want to talk about this sort of topic so much. But protecting the data in the system was the number one area of importance to organizations. Yeah, and then behind that, when an attack is in progress, I need to be able to detect it and do something about it, right? And then of course there's the pressure to secure cloud-based data, which ironically, depending on how you set things up in the cloud, can actually be easier than protecting an on-premise system, right? Because once someone is inside your network, as we've seen at so many organizations, you often, if you don't detect that initial breach, then they can spend their time feeling their way across the network. I mean, it's happened from, I think most recently it happened on, what was it? No, it wasn't Twitch. Was it Twitch? No, it was one of the.
Yeah, Twitch was a big one.
Right. But I mean,
Yeah.
they expose source code and all sorts of different things. I mean, it's not.
EA as well, if that's the one you're thinking of.
What's that?
EA Games also had a big source code
Oh,
issue.
yeah. But I mean, it's they're inside the system. They're able to access things and spend their time moving around. It happened that, one of the biggest ones that people know of is Sony. But I mean, it's happened to SAP customers as well. I mean, we had there was a panel, we had a security focused event a couple of months back in July, and some of the different customers that have been exposed in this way, obviously we didn't talk about them by name, but they're definitely happening. And one of the concerns that people have, I think, particularly this year, is around ransomware. And that's SAP systems are not necessarily targeted for ransomware attacks in the same way that your operational systems may be. However, one of the things that happened with Colonial Pipeline was that sort of caused them a lot of problems was not the initial ransomware attack, but the fact that they took all their operational systems offline to prevent cross-contamination. And many SAP systems are never taken down. So what do you do when you have to shut down your SAP systems and then they're down for a few days and you have to bring them back up again? Because this is not necessarily something that organizations think about. Unless you're doing desktop testing, unless you're doing pen testing, you're not necessarily aware of, those sort of other potential scenarios where your SAP systems might be exposed and might be problematic, where you have to actually bring something down and then bring it back up again. Because maybe when you're moving from ECC to S4, you had a system down. But I mean, apart from that, those systems are often running, particularly in global enterprises, 365 by 24. So because they have to be. So it's really interesting from the perspective of, what people are concerned about and how they're protecting the data in their SAP systems. And I think your next slide talks a little bit about, it's related to that same research. It's like, what are the biggest challenges that people say they're facing? Detecting potential threats, protecting data. But I mean, even just keeping up with patches and updates. I mean, that could be a challenge for SAP customers, and many customers I spoke with face that challenge because, it's, well, which ones are the most important ones to apply? Which are the ones that I need to have in the system? How do I time it, particularly in a large company, so that it's not impacting, any sort of business? We're not going to have any, I mean, even planned downtime can be expensive for an organization. Unplanned downtime, I think we saw in our cloud report, I mean, it can take, the average amount of time it takes for organizations to resolve an outage is 1 to 6 hours. But I mean, that was, almost 50% of respondents, but for many it was longer. And, even if it's planned downtime, that can be a cost for the organization. Securing your custom code. I know one of the partners I've spoken with on an event said that, for every million lines of code, there's, 1,000 potential flaws in the code or something like that, right? So, you've got that, you've got auditing user privileges, particularly if you're moving from systems like ECC to S4, a lot of the roles changed from a privilege perspective. And, the same is true within HR, and particularly within HR systems, because you need to protect the data that's in those systems. So, there's really interesting, once you start looking at it from a data perspective, and particularly what SAP users are trying to do for their SAP systems to protect what's in there.
Absolutely, and Robert, there are a lot of interesting points you made in that and in going through that research, and thanks for sharing that. And one that you mentioned when we were looking at the previous slide, which we see a lot given the nature of just kind of the full, kind of protecting everything from the mobile device up to the cloud app and the data in it itself, is that credential compromise attack chain that you mentioned. A lot of times what we see is that the credentials will be compromised usually through a mobile app or device, and then the attacker will basically take those credentials, turn over to their on their desk to their computer, and then log in to, try to log into any of the, countless, corporate applications we all use. And, the point you made about lateral movement is an important one, because understanding how users are interacting with data and kind of having a baseline, being able to figure out what's anomalous, is definitely a key part of data protection these days. And it also, it aligns with the shared responsibility model with cloud providers themselves, right? Because they don't want to be liable. AWS doesn't want to be liable for every single time somebody has even a small data breach on their, running on their services. So they say, okay, well, we'll secure all the Amazon stuff, but anything above that, that's on you. So I think that, I think that probably ties into a lot of the challenges that you've mentioned here, but it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, kind of where that responsibility differentiation exists and what people can do about understanding where those threats are. And again, that visibility side of it is really important. And the other thing, which I think is interesting too, is that in this slide in particular, that you've got kind of the runaway here with detecting potential threats, but then between protecting data and ensuring segregation of duties, kind of from left to the end of the right there, it looks like there's probably only about maybe a 7 or 8% difference in second and eighth most important thing. So I think it just shows how broad these security challenges are, and the number of issues that people have to deal with, and the number of issues that people see is pretty critical. So let's see, I think we got one more here. All right, cool. So Madhu, I'm gonna bring this back to you here. I think one thing people would love to hear about is kind of some customer journey observations you've made, some of the challenges, some of the ways people address those, maybe some of the drivers behind how they fix things up. So I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, surely, Hank. So let me share my experiences with one of our customer. In this case, this is a large energy sector customer having global operations in multiple countries, employees spread in more than 30 plus countries. So the customer was using an on-premises SAP HCM system, and they had a vision to migrate to cloud-based systems, and they've chosen SAP SuccessFactors. And as they started their journey, they started asking about some of the security challenges that they need to tackle. And some of the things that came up is, as we mentioned, definitely the compliance, especially being a global company with operations. They wanted to be very careful to move the HR data so that it meets both the international and the local country-specific regulations as well. And as they move, because this is a cloud-based HR system, and with cloud, the promise is the application can be accessed from any device, any user, any location. So they wanted to make sure that some of the concepts of zero trust principles, like which user should be able to access the system from which location and gain access to specific data sets, are considered and thought carefully before they move to the cloud application. Because in on-premises world, it's pretty much most of the users come into the network, they're either coming from laptops. Very few customers had allowed employees access HR systems from mobile devices as well. So it was a very different landscape for an on-premises system, but cloud is really bringing a lot of productivity to the users with the definition of access from anywhere and any location. But that also brings kind of situations and challenges for security teams to deal with as they think about the migration. And the third thing that we heard is access to these applications, especially on the data itself. Once the user gets into the application, what specific data set should a specific user access within that system is extremely critical. And SuccessFactors has an amazing role-based access control engine, defining which user can access what kind of data sets, But the challenge doesn't stop there. Even if it is a privileged user, sometimes privileged users have access to a lot more higher quality of data sets. How do we ensure that the privileged users especially are monitored properly? Do we have tools in place to ensure that privileged users are accessing the right data sets? Was another challenge. So those were some of the challenges the customer started the journey with some objectives. If you could move to the next slide, Hank. And the objectives were very clear. The customer wanted to use SuccessFactors as a cloud-based HR application in a secure and a compliant way. They want to make sure that the user data stays protected. And we'll talk about some of the best practices in the next few minutes. And the customer definitely wanted to use modern approaches and ensure that more modern attack vectors are considered, because the threats are, as you pointed out earlier, with credential compromise kind of scenarios. From a security team standpoint, it looks like as if it's an inside user using the system, but that's not the case. So understanding the insiders' behaviors and detecting any anomalous behaviors is very critical in the modern security landscape. And trying to some zero trust principles about trust but verify. That's the model most of the modern enterprises are taking when it comes to securing the systems. Ensuring you're verifying the user accessing the system and accessing the data at every touch point is extremely critical. So those were some of the objectives the customer started with as they migrated. And if you could move to the next slide, I can talk about some of the experiences of how they got there. Right. My suggestion is security is a journey, and it's not like turn on, turn off. My recommendation is to take it as a journey and do a defense in depth kind of a model. So the first step in the journey is to discover, understand, gain visibility into your users' activities, especially with SAP systems. Privileged users becomes extremely important. They have some extremely high permissions in terms of accessing the user's data, in terms of modifying the user data, exporting the data, editing the data, etc. So make sure we have tools in place to ensure that IT administrators and security teams gain full visibility into who is accessing what kind of data. Second is access. We talked about the benefits of cloud, anytime, any device benefits, but especially if organizations are global companies and if you're dealing with regulations, there are certain regulations which tells certain data sets cannot be accessed by employees from certain countries. Classic example is in Europe. So make sure there are tools in place to ensure that the customer understands which user is coming from which location, which device, and then give access to SuccessFactors application. For example, in this case, customer said, hey, I don't want my employees logging in from countries where we don't have operations, especially from mobile devices. And we want to be able to selectively provide access to requests coming from certain countries. So that's one example of how you can prevent credential compromise, because we have seen some patterns on, especially in threats and hijack kind of scenarios, there are certain geographical locations which deem to be a lot more riskier than the others. So ensuring you're putting tools in place to secure the access to SuccessFactors or any SAP systems becomes critical. And third is, once you give access to the system, like Robert was mentioning, there are a lot of opportunities for the bad actor to proliferate into your systems and put some malicious code to extract more and more data and sensitive information from your systems. So ensure you have tools to prevent such behaviors. And these can be malwares, viruses, more importantly, anomalous behaviors of the users. Imagine a user downloading all of your employees' PII data, and it's so easy. And that's why SAP systems are very critical, because they hold very sensitive information. All it takes is for me to generate one report with all employees' PII data and click that download button. you're done. It's such a critical system. So ensuring we have tools in place to understand the behaviors and ensuring people have access to right data sets and threats is extremely important. The fourth is to protect the data itself. So it's very hard to differentiate if a user is downloading this corporate data for a right use or for a wrong use. Right? It's very, very hard. So having tools in place to understand what kind of data is being downloaded and ensuring that there are tools in place to protect the data is extremely important. And I'll give you an example. By nature, SAP is very secure. Anything that's for data at rest, for data residing in SAP systems, SAP puts a lot of security controls in place in terms of database encryption, in terms of role-based access controls, etc. But what we are seeing off late is, as you talked about segregation of duties, it is the customer's responsibility on how users and employees are accessing the data, right? And that's where some of the breaches are happening too, because inadvertent usage of the data, people downloading data unknowingly and sharing it to USB sticks or personal accounts and things like those. Right. So ensuring that there are protections in place. For example, if a user is downloading sensitive data, have some checks and balances, like challenge the user with MFA, or if it is really highly critical data, ensure that their data is encrypted and on the endpoint as well, so that the file stays protected and administrators have revoking capabilities when the user leaves the organization. Things like those. Make sure that there is a well-rounded protection around the data, especially when the data is taken out of SAP systems onto different devices. Right. And finally, we saw this customer, by following those best practices, they were able to achieve compliance to various GRC regulations like GDPR, CCPA, HIPAA, and other things, just to make sure that the overall SAP system is secure and their migration was safe and secure too.
Awesome, thank you, Madhu. Thanks for going through all that. I like the way Madhu lays this out. I think it makes it, like you said at the start, understanding that security, regardless of the context it's in, really is a journey. And I think looking at it in these steps, kind of, these days I feel like there's a lot that makes implementing secure practices, especially things like zero trust, seem kind of like this insurmountable feat that you have to perfect within record time. And I think that really breaking it down into consumable steps, regardless of what type of security you're trying to implement, is really key to making sure that you do so in a way that speaks to the needs of your organization, because everybody has different needs around this stuff. So Madhu, thank you for running through this. This is super helpful. All right, so I think that is most of it. Robert, I'll kick it back to you. We have a few challenges or questions here. If anyone wants to chime in about any of these that they saw in their organization, but Robert, I'll hand it back over to you.
All right, thanks, Hank, and thank you, Madhu, as well. Just as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please go to the questions panel or the questions section of the control panel that you have there, and then type in a question and hit submit. We would love to answer your questions. I think it was interesting because one of the things that Madhu was just talking about in that customer journey, sort of resonated a little bit with what we saw. You talked about people accessing SAP systems from different geographies and different sorts of things. One of our at the event that I was talking about a couple of months back, there was a story that came up where in one particular organization, they suddenly noticed a login coming from Eastern Europe, and I don't remember which country. And they're like, do you have an office in Eastern Europe? But it turned out that it was one of the developers visiting his mother, but he hadn't told anybody he was going to be over there, but it sort of, threw up some alarms. It, potentially was a concern for the organization, because they suddenly saw someone connecting from an IP address that was in a country that they didn't recognize. But I mean, these sorts of challenges are certainly things, that organizations need to pay attention to, and make sure that when you're, developers are traveling when they're, if they're going to be working while they're off site, you know what that is. I mean, the challenge, now is that, you might think that your team is all, in the same general area of, or same vicinity of your office, but that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, people, particularly in this remote environment, if they're working remotely, they've relocated to areas that are cheaper, more comfortable. Perhaps they've always wanted to be there, but haven't been able to do it because of work. Suddenly you might find that you have people connecting from states that you hadn't expected you had teams in, simply because of the people have moved remotely. So yeah, I mean, we would definitely like to know, what are some of the challenges that you faced? Are there questions that you have for us around challenges that you've had? Regarding your cloud deployments, what are some of the things that you're using to measure success? Weird or surprising security related issues that have sort of come up within your organization? Have questions on those, or anything that you've sort of seen from a compliance standpoint that we haven't necessarily discussed here? So I mean, maybe I can ask you guys this. You do a lot of work securing SAP systems, SAP SuccessFactors particularly. What's sort of a weird thing that you've seen come up that has sort of been a little surprising from a security standpoint?
Madhu, I'll definitely let you take that one, given you're the one who has a lot more external facing experience.
It's more around access and understanding the posture of both the user and the device that is connecting to, that we constantly hear as one of the access challenges.
And I'll add on to that, because even though I don't speak with customers quite as frequently as Madhu, I do get a chance to speak with other industry analysts a lot, and kind of get a little bit more of a feel of what people are saying on a broader scale. And that's an interesting point you bring up, Madhu, because the difficulty we find a lot of people have when they deploy out something like this, and they say, okay, I want to make sure that all my users are protected or are secure when they connect in. The idea of the device doesn't really cross their mind until they realize, okay, I've got this huge mix, especially, I mean, again, to Robert's point about people working from everywhere. Working from everywhere doesn't just mean different networks, it means different devices. And so one of the biggest things we see is people have difficulty when they come to us extending the same access principles across all of their users and devices. And that kind of ties to that uniform access challenge that I spoke about at the start. Making sure that you can extend the zero trust mindset, the zero trust approach to users, regardless of if they're on Windows, Mac, Android, iOS, Chromebooks, iPads, whatever it may be. That's definitely a big one that I think people do. They kind of pops up as something that they realize they maybe should have thought about, but then it doesn't become a reality until they actually move to deploy the system.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think one of the other things that Madhu talked about was sort of starting by, for example, putting multi-factor authentication in place for specific users on the systems, right? This was also one of the things that we identified in that security research back in April, like the places from a technology standpoint that you probably should start with single sign-on, right? So that, users aren't necessarily typing, and, I mean, it makes for a better user experience to a certain extent, but it also means that only authenticated devices are necessarily coming through because they've gone through adding multi-factor authentication. These are some of the basic starting points when it comes to securing your SAP systems, and probably your enterprise systems in general, but particularly when it comes to SAP systems, those are key places that you can make a change, make a difference within what you're doing, that potentially allows you to better protect your system, better protect your data. And it certainly gives you something that's more secure as a foundational starting point. And it's so it's very interesting from that perspective. And then, maybe moving beyond that, you can look at things like, using VPNs, so that you're securing your connectivity between your remote developers and your systems, secure user provisioning, some sort of continuous monitoring on your system, data encryption. I mean, Madhu made the point that many SAP systems already have data encryption built into them, but, and then they also offer, but in putting that in place maybe for systems that are connected to your SAP systems or pulling data from your SAP systems, particularly this is a challenge around analytics solutions, because if you're pulling data out of your SAP systems to create a data lake that you're then trying to do something with, and then you have access governance controls, business process controls, and you can move into topics more like vulnerability management, where you're taking a more proactive approach to trying to identify problems before they occur. So, I mean, from a technologies perspective, there's definitely some things you can start with that are pretty easy, VPN, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, and then you can go all the way to code vulnerability analysis, UI masking tools, et cetera, so that you're ensuring that your SAP data is as protected as you can make it.
Yeah, and another thing that I think ties to a lot of that is when we talk about, we've been talking a lot about access and understanding what users are doing and all that, and a lot of that obviously ties to zero trust, and I like to take the approach that I think zero trust has kind of become an industry buzzword. I think it's sort of become a filler for when you don't really know what to say when you're offering, whether it's guidance or whatever it may be. Just say that what you do applies to zero trust, and it's kind of created this, like I said before, it's kind of become one of those muddled terms that's maybe lost some of its true meaning. But the way that when people do ask me about it, the guidance I give them is to think about it in this way, and I won't go through the full thing because it's a whole other conversation, but I have these just because statements of zero trust, right? That kind of help understand, all right, what are the core values of zero trust? What does it really mean? Kind of outside of all the people saying they can do everything they need to solve your zero trust challenges, which no one can, but it requires a kind of a combination of approaches. But the two that I think apply most to our conversation are that they're just because the username and password are correct doesn't mean it's the user in question. And then also just because it is a user or device we know doesn't mean that we can fully trust them to not do something that's detrimental to the company. And I think that's a really interesting conversation, because we've touched on this idea of sort of the insider threat. And we've even seen, I mean, you see it every few months, with some story about an employee was getting fired, so they went in and took a bunch of IP before they went to their next company, and it was a competitor, and all this. I think there are a few stories we can all think of in regards to that. But Robert, I'd be curious to know, did that come up at all as a concern? The idea of someone who isn't necessarily a bad actor doing something with the intention of hurting the company and being able to, especially with something like, when I think of SuccessFactors, like the amount of HR related data that somebody could take and say, well, I'm going to steal this and sell it to the highest bidder, whatever it may be, right? Just curious if anything like that ever came up in your research and your conversations.
It's certainly come up in conversations. I mean, and I think it sort of ties into that concept of credentials compromise, because I mean, it's someone abusing credentials. It might be somebody else's credentials that have been compromised. They might even be abusing their own credentials, particularly, to get access to the system. And, if you don't change default passwords, if there are many SAP users and systems that have administrative access, you have to go in and make sure you change those. Next year's report, probably, which will be in the March timeframe, I want to analyze a little more, what are the threats that people think they're seeing or they want to address? I mean, so we looked this year at what are the technologies, what is the biggest challenge people are facing, what are the technologies they're using to sort of protect themselves. This year, I sort of want to switch the focus a little more to be, what are the potential threats that people think, they're facing as an organization? Is it, ransomware, which is sort of the big thing that people are talking about, But I think, you know, for many SAP organizations, it is much more around this abusing of credentials. You know, as you said, someone coming in, download it, you know, running that report, PII report, you know, exporting the data, leaving it in an Amazon, exposed in an Amazon, you know, Amazon site somewhere, and then all of a sudden, like half the world has your PII data, right? You know, it's happened to so many organizations, and you know, it's certainly something that was hinted at, but wasn't necessarily explicitly said in our survey results. But I mean, reading between the lines, you can certainly see that people are concerned about that, because I mean, as I said, I mean, you know, particularly as organizations look at SAP systems and start connecting them, you know, they pull data either in from other systems within the enterprise, you know, or they, you know, running analytics on top of that data. I mean, if you can get access to what's in the SAP systems, you have a pretty comprehensive view of what's going on in that organization. And that can be exploited either for commercial, you know, commercial reasons by a competitor, you know, or for, you know, someone who's looking to discredit the organization, or, you know, whatever it happens to be. I mean, there's lots of different ways that can be exploited. And, you know, that's certainly the challenge that I think organizations are facing today when it comes to protecting their data. There is one question that sort of came in here. And what was asked is, I'm interested to hear if the speakers are aware of any particular compliance challenges with regard to the transition from SAP HCM to Employee Central as a master employee data platform. For instance, due to a different position management concept or data replication issues that might lead to personal data breaches, and, you know, how those potentially might be mitigated. So that's kind of a big question, but you know, in your experience, have you run into sort of compliance challenges with moving from, you know, SAP's older on-premise HCM product to Employee Central? You know, things that had to be addressed along the way?
Yeah, I can take that question. I won't say challenges, but it is definitely one of the important topic to think as we move data. The good thing is, in SuccessFactors at least, Employee Central is built with baked in a lot of compliance templates. So as part of the data migration, you can just map to which specific data field a non-premises field will map. And there are tools available to migrate the data itself. And once you move the data into Employee Central, there are a lot of compliance templates for regions as well. So we didn't find more challenges on the fact of moving, or how once the data is moved, SAP SuccessFactors deals with that data. One area we have seen customers is that, especially in highly regulated industries, usually customers had one or two specific data fields, like military IDs and government IDs, which are very, very sensitive. And they were just not comfortable in moving that specific data element, just one or two, maybe in the order of 5, 10-ish across the thousands, that they were just not comfortable moving to cloud applications. So we did talk to customers, and we have some, we helped them with some encryption technologies and safely move the data into cloud and be compliant with various data residency laws around the countries like Canada, Russia, and others.
Great. Other questions that attendees might have, or that you would like to hear us talk about? We've got a few minutes left here. Yeah, I know that we asked the question here, how are you measuring the success of your cloud deployments? In the customers that you've worked with, Madhu, Hank, you know, what is it, when, you know, when someone comes and, you know, potentially looks at investing in a solution, you know, like the one that you guys provide, you know, what are the sort of the KPIs they're using to measure the success of that investment? You know, not necessarily, you know, the specific technology they used, but they're like, I want to have something that achieves X, right? I want to be able to measure, what are they actually measuring when they're talking to you folks?
One that I'll offer, and Madhu probably has more in-depth insight into this, but one that I've seen is, I think that everybody acknowledges that they will always be adding more to their cloud infrastructure. And so I think it's kind of the future outlook of, when, especially with the security product, how easily or how certain can I be, and then eventually they end up measuring it out by the ease of basically integrating any future technologies. Because when you go through a proof of concept or something like that, yeah, you try it out on a few of your existing solutions and kind of make sure it works generally, and then you apply it more broadly. But when it comes to them saying, well, when I inevitably need to take on this type of technology, or people know that they'll be adding maybe more development tools or other cloud-based platforms to their infrastructure, it's what's the success rate and what's the efficiency of being able to kind of pull those applications under this same sort of security umbrella, if you will.
Yeah, I can add on to Hank. I mean, one of the success criteria we see is for organizations to make their own internal audit. And we've seen organizations who were not able to make their internal audit as the data is moved to cloud, because there are a lot of tools in place. If it is an on-premises system that helps meet GRC and internal audit needs, as the data is now moving to clouds, we have seen customers facing those challenges. So one of the success criteria for security tools can be, is this tool helping me meet my internal compliance, especially for HR systems and ERP systems and CRM systems that SAP has.
Great. Had another question come in here, and I think it'll probably be our last question, given that we're just a couple minutes left. What experience do you guys have with, actually there's a couple more that come in, with organizations that are not willing to stop using SAP completely on-premise, right? So they're not able to necessarily fully embrace SuccessFactors Employee Central. Have you seen that a lot?
That's a shift. That's a shift that's happening, right? A lot of customers want to move to cloud, and most of our product offerings and tool sets that we offer are for the cloud versions of SAP. We do see some requests coming for on-premises deployments, especially, but not in SuccessFactors world though. We see that coming from S/4HANA and applications that are running on HANA platforms. That's a different conversation, but specifically talking about the HR platform, which is the ECC, on-premises version, we're seeing a significant drive, customers moving from on-premises to cloud. And if I remember, I think SAP called an end of life for on-premises version by 2025, I believe so.
I guess another interesting question here then, and this will be our last one. Do you find that organizations are upskilling their existing security teams, or are they bringing on personnel that have experience with cloud? They're sort of trying to, I guess this organization is trying to determine who is responsible for what, and it's kind of a gray area. What have you seen?
Yes, absolutely. We have seen organizations bringing in experts to understand the security or the general postures when they move to cloud. But broadly, I would say two things, right? There's data at rest and there's data in use. Data at rest means data that's residing in SAP systems. So there are some security tools that must be in place to protect the data at rest in SAP systems. And then there's data in use, where thousands of users are accessing the data, and there might be some tools in place to be put for data in use. That's what I would say. But yes, absolutely, it's a good, and we have seen a lot of customers taking help in understanding what that segregation of duty means and what tools should we put for data in use versus data at rest.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much, everyone. Hank and Madhu, I appreciate your speaking at today's webinar. Thank you for attending. Shortly after the event, you will receive an email reminder to access the presentation on demand, along with a copy of today's slideshow. So on behalf of SAP Insider and our guests at Lookout, thank you for your time and have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.